Let's go ahead and take a look county by county here on the east side. Right now, Spokane County, you can see in 2016 went for Bernie. Right now, it is going for Biden. Now, just by 228 votes with 63% reporting, but still going for Biden.
Whew, boy. Those are some statements. So let's start with the obvious. The court determined that in Washington, about 30,000 customers were given the plan without their knowledge.
Don't though drug addicts still deserve things like food and shelter and blankets?
Do you think it's responsible of the president to be questioning the integrity of the election right now?
How come the center was created before the technology was brought on and before these people were trained?
So when it comes to sheriffs and state law, we can verify that the 1639 situation is a first.
That's made rallies like this one become even more of a concern. As you can see behind me here, well over 100 people.
This video of a homeless camp used as evidence of Spokane's homeless problem isn't in Spokane at all. It's Baltimore.
There is just a ton of rubble right in the middle of the road right now. And if you look just a few feet to the left here, you can see another hot spot here and another one right over there, another one behind it there. Now, the fire truck was sent to go try to figure out where that break was. And then in the process of trying to do that, the road just collapsed beneath them. This here is the actual pump that gave way, and it now needs to be completely replaced. That process could take several more weeks.
The new bill will move the Washington presidential primary 11 weeks earlier. Now, to understand what that change means, we've got to dive into the rather complex primary election system. Washington does elections a little differently from most other states. Washingtonians don't register with a particular party because local and state elections have the top two primary system. That, of course, means that the top two vote getters go on to the general regardless of party. But when it comes to the president, throw all that out. It's totally different. In a presidential primary, you're not actually running for an office, you're running for a party's nomination. And it's up to each party how to decide that nominee. Right now, both parties use a system where each state is given a certain number of delegates who vote for the nominee. How those delegates' votes are decided varies by party and state. Some use a balloted primary, some use a caucus where voters physically gather together. Some use a little of each. In Washington, every registered voter gets a primary ballot, like this. It's got two columns, one filled with Democratic candidates and one filled with Republican candidates. You can only vote in one column, and to vote in either, you have to sign a statement promising that you won't vote in the primary or caucus of the other. Which party you choose is public record, but which candidate you vote for isn't. Now, this was an issue of contention in Olympia this year. Some lawmakers wanted to add an option for independents, but those proposals failed. So, how much weight does this ballot actually carry? For Republicans, a lot. Washington's Republican delegates are decided entirely by the primary, divvied up proportionally. For Democrats, we don't know yet. In the last election, the ballot didn't matter at all. The state party decided in 2016 that delegates would be entirely determined by a caucus. That might change in 2020, though. The party will make a decision on that next month. So what's changing now because of this new bill? Well, there are a few smaller procedural changes, but the big shift is when the primary will be held. Historically, Washington has held the primary in late May, making it one of the very last states to go. But now the primary will be held in mid-March. Why does that matter? Well, in the past, by the time it was Washington's turn, the nominations have usually been wrapped up. In 2016, every candidate but Trump had already dropped out weeks before the Washington primary. By moving the primary up, lawmakers are hoping Washington voters might get more of a say in who their party's presidential nominees are. So many ways to answer that question. Are we better off? I decided to focus on three of them, the ones that most reflect how the law has impacted day-to-day life. 1, prices. 2, selection. And 3, tax revenue for the state. We also want to hear from you. What is most important to you when buying alcohol? You can join the conversation using the Vote Now tab on the KREM 2 mobile app.
The deceptive ads against 1183 make claims about taxes that have been deemed false by Washington's Attorney General.
Back in 2011, Costco broke records by spending more than $20 million pushing Initiative 1183. They made a lot of promises.
That will provide more funds for vital public services without raising taxes. and bring more competitive prices to consumers.
But did those promises bear out? We looked into the data. Washington keeps stats on the average price for a liter of booze, including tax. And since the switch in 2012, prices have gone up by nearly 20%. But that's not adjusted for inflation. If you make that adjustment, it's still an increase, though just under 8%. So, on average at least, on prices, we're not better off. Costco said they had no comment for this story. So we took a trip down the street to Rosar's, where we talked with store manager Harry Wilson.
Well, the pricing is competitive.
He knows that prices on average have gone up, but also that averages don't tell the full story.
From what I hear from customers, because of the amount of taxes that they're charging, it's a little bit more expensive now to buy it in the store.
Do you think that having multiple places selling at different prices can result in some liquors being cheaper?
Yeah, some liquors are. There's no doubt about it. So it just depends on which venue you're talking about and what their profit margins are.
More options also means big stores can buy in bulk and get better deals they can pass on to consumers. But not all liquor sellers are a fan of those bulk deals.
Now, the law says that stores have to be at least 10,000 square feet in order to sell liquor. But there is an exception. Buildings that used to house state liquor stores were auctioned off, and many of them became private liquor stores, like this one.
I've owned this store for 6.5 years since the privatization took over.
Eggers South Hill Liquor is one of just 2 such stores still in business in Spokane County.
Myself and Medical Lake.
Smaller stores can't buy in bulk the way big boxes can.
How do you compete with the big box stores?
I can't compete with the big box stores. One, the big box stores have huge buying power.
The only way they get by is through taking smaller margins.
Yeah, if I wanted to run on a huge, higher profit margin, I would be so priced out.
And by developing a loyal clientele. They do that through promotions, special orders, and above all else, selection.
If they're looking for something and we can find it, we bring it in for them. You won't find that at the big box stores or the grocery stores.
And that brings us to our second metric. Do customers really have more options now than they used to?
This one's a little trickier to analyze. There's not a lot of hard data out there, but we can take a sort of unscientific approach by just kind of going around to stores and seeing how many varieties of, say, bourbon they have.
Eggers, for instance, had 51 varieties. The Walmart location I stopped at had 12. Same goes for Target. This Rosar's had 13, 15 at Trader Joe's, 17 at Winco, 19 at Rite Aid. Fred Meyer had 27 kinds of bourbon, 31 at Safeway, and 33 at Albertsons. And naturally, Total Wine blows them all away. I counted 168 varieties of bourbon. And for comparison, the Idaho state-run liquor store I stopped through in Post Falls had 76 kinds of bourbon. So, are we better off when it comes to selection? That sort of depends on where you live. If you're close to a specialty store like Eggers or Total Wine, you're probably pretty pleased with your options. But if you're reliant on grocery stores, you might have fewer choices than you used to when the state ran things. Then again, you also might not care. Lots of customers aren't looking for rare liquors and they prefer the convenience of the grocery store.
Not a lot of profit. What it's about convenience for the customer. It's here for that person that doesn't want to have to drive all over and hunt up something.
Okay, that brings us to our final metric, tax revenue. Costco and friends promised millions in new dollars for state programs. So, did that happen? Well, that's a tough question to answer. Here's why. When liquor was state-run, revenue came from taxes and liquor sales. Now, revenue comes from taxes and liquor fees. And they're collected by different agencies. To make matters worse, one of those agencies also collects marijuana taxes, and the data gets a bit jumbled up. So, it's hard to isolate liquor-specific profits. But doing the best we can, here's what we came up with. This graph shows a sharp drop-off in liquor profits immediately after privatization. They appear to be on the way back up, but it's still not where it used to be. Basically, tax revenue has gone up over the past decade, but not by enough to offset the lost revenue from selling booze outright. So, private liquor, are we better off? On price, not on average, though there are exceptions since you can shop around. On selection, you've normally got fewer brands, but more locations. And on tax revenue, it's hard to isolate, but generally it appears we aren't better off.
Now, guys, one more thing I'll throw in there because I know this was a big concern during the 2011 election, public health. Now, this is just one metric, but CDC data shows alcohol consumption and binge drinking rates, both in Washington and the Spokane area, have basically stayed the same since liquor went private. If anything, they've gone slightly down. That also plays into an interesting fact I learned from a liquor trade group. In Washington, liquor sales are up, and it's cutting into wine and beer sales. So rather than just drinking more overall, people are just involving hard liquor more often in their drinking habits now that it's easier to get.
It certainly is interesting to
It
kind of
is.
analyze all those different metrics when you break it down. I think for a lot of people, convenience is the big one, right?
Exactly. I mean, even if all those other things seem like we might be worse off, a lot of people say, well, it's worth it for the convenience to be able to buy it when I'm buying all my other groceries.
And I, for one, didn't know there were 168 different bourbons.
I didn't either until I went in there.
Just learned that.
Yeah.
The more you know. Okay,
Impressive
thank you,
selection there.
Casey. Great stuff.